and welcome to International House and to the U Chicago Alumni Weekend, an annual event that brings alumni and friends from across the university together to reconnect with old friends, network with new faces, and reminisce about times on campus. My name is Denise Jorgens, and I'm the Director of International House here at the University of Chicago. The mission of International House and International Houses Worldwide, which is currently a network of 19 houses on 4 continents, is to enable students and scholars from around the world to live and learn together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Here at International House of Chicago, this mission is achieved by daily interaction among our students and scholars through our unique facilities and student life activities, and through our internationally focused public programs designed to foster diversity of thought and experience. Tonight's lecture program is one of over 200 programs held at International House of Chicago each year. Whether it's a music or dance performance, a film festival, cultural or national celebration, a lecture, conference, or symposium, International House presents programs that advance cross-cultural understanding and promote civic discourse on community, national, and world affairs. These programs would not be possible without the support and participation of organizations across the campus and around the city. For today's program, we are so grateful to the University of Chicago Pozen Family Center for Human Rights for allowing us to partner with them on their 2019 Robert F. Kirschner Human Rights Memorial Lecture. On behalf of the global International House community, I want to welcome you again and thank you for coming tonight. I hope to see many of you throughout Alumni Weekend. And now I would like to introduce Mark Bradley, Faculty Director of the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, and the Bernadette E. Schmidt Distinguished Service Professor of History and Deputy Dean of the Social Sciences Division, who will begin tonight's program. Thank you again for coming.
Good evening and welcome to our annual Kirschner Lecture. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. My colleague Alice Kim will be coming up to introduce Dean Spade in just a moment, but I wanted to say a little something about the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights and thank a few people and also give some recognition to some college graduates who have been a part of our Pozen community over the last 4 years. So our center is really concerned with trying to think about the intersection of human rights theory and human rights practice, and to put both of those things in conversation in research, but also in the kinds of work that people are doing in the world. If you're leafing through your program, there are a list of human rights minors who are graduating from the program this year. They give you a sense of the kind of diversity of students who are engaged in the program in one form or another. We have had a human rights internship program for how many years, Susan, as the internship? 20 years. Again, giving opportunities to students in the summer to be working with human rights NGOs, government organizations, and the like. A list of our human rights interns also there in the program for you. But we're also working on graduate and doctoral education, training in a way those who will teach human rights at higher education institutions throughout the United States and throughout the globe. And some of the awards and prizes that we've given to those students are also listed in your program. We are thrilled this year to have initiated a new program in the center, a human rights laboratory that is focusing particularly on questions of mass incarceration in the United States and beyond. And Alice Kim is the director, first director of this program, And one of the reasons that we have Dean here is thinking about how the Kirschner Lecture could be working along with the Human Rights Laboratory in doing a certain kind of advocacy and political work. I think Barbara Kirschner is with us today, as are some members of her family. Bob was a founder of the Human Rights Program. I think the sensibilities of the lab are the kinds of things that Bob would have been really responsive to if he were around to enjoy that. So again, it seems particularly appropriate to have that connection going on today. So without further ado, Alice, do you want to come up and tell us a little bit about Dean's background? And Dean, welcome to Chicago. We're delighted to have you here.
Good evening, everyone. So I have long admired Dean Spade's work and scholarship, and I'm thrilled to welcome him to Chicago and introduce him to all of you. In 2002, just out of law school, Dean founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. He raised enough money to rent a desk and a phone at a larger poverty law organization in New York, and by word of mouth, he spread the word to other service providers, drug treatment centers, legal aid offices, needle exchanges, and other community organizations, that he was providing free legal help to trans people. And the calls came pouring in. As Dean describes in his book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, I met an endless stream of people facing a series of interlocking problems related to being basically unfathomable to the administrative systems that govern the distribution of life chances. His clients faced police profiling, police brutality, false arrest, sexual harassment and assault, beatings and rapes, firings from jobs, evictions, denials, rejection from legal services, and family rejection. At a time when trans people had nowhere to turn, Dean saw a need and went about the work of creating a project that could serve that need. Since 2002, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project has become a thriving nonprofit law collective. With a staff of 6 and a core team, of which Dean remains an active member, SRLP works to guarantee that all people are free to self-determine gender identity and expression regardless of income or race and without facing harassment, discrimination, or violence. The work of SRLP saves lives, and it started with a desk and a phone and Dean's incredible courage and initiative. Like Sylvia Rivera, the civil rights pioneer and veteran of the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, Dean is a tireless advocate and persistent voice for trans people, for people of color, for those who are low income. He works to center issues of systemic poverty and racism, and to privilege the struggles of queer and trans people who face the most severe and multifaceted discrimination. In Seattle, Dean is also a leading voice standing up against the carceral state and the way that it pervades and invades our everyday lives. He's been working to stop the development of a new youth jail. And as he and his fellow organizers and activists make the case that dressing children ages 10 to 17 in jail garb and slippers and putting them into cages where they are monitored by armed guards is traumatizing, dehumanizing, disruptive to school and family, and only prepares them for future incarceration. It does not teach them a lesson, and it does not make us safer. It is a failed intervention, and we must end it. So not one to mince words, Dean always pushes us to think more critically about the work, to connect the dots, and to challenge the systems that are caging people instead of investing in human needs. In my own work against police torture and mass incarceration, Dean's critique of the legal system has been crucial in helping us understand the limitations of the legal system. As a lawyer for the people, he takes a critical approach to the legal system and challenges us to demand more than what can be won in a legal system. And in his own words, that was formed by and exists to perpetuate capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. His critique is honest, refreshing, and necessary. In this political moment, Dean's work and scholarship illuminates a praxis of resistance that refuses to accept the logic of neoliberalism and the carceral state. He asks us to imagine a world without imprisonment, without colonialism, immigration enforcement, sexual violence, or wealth disparity. Audre Lorde said, "Unless one lives and loves in the trenches, it is difficult to remember that the war against dehumanization is ceaseless." Dean is someone who certainly lives and loves in the trenches. His work is a reminder to remain vigilant against the forces of dehumanization. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Dean Spade.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm very embarrassed. And thank you so much to the Pozen Family Center for inviting me here. I'm so grateful to be here, and to the Kirschner family. I'm just really honored to be part of this lineage of events and scholars and activists working together to make big change. I'm more nervous than usual because I have such a high regard for so many activists and scholars in Chicago. It feels like even more terrifying than usual to be like, do I have something to offer you all? But I hope it's useful. I want to just start, today, whenever I go somewhere new, I always start by just researching a little bit about the history of the place that I'm in. And it was interesting to learn about the University of Chicago being founded in 1890, and to think about what was happening in the United States at that time and what was happening right here. And then to learn earlier about some of the treaties that resulted in Europeans occupying this land, and to think generally about the groups that have lived here, both prior to European colonization, and then also the periods of indigenous people being pushed back into Chicago through later programs that the US government used to eliminate land claims on various reservations. So I just want to, as we're here in this building and on this campus, just try to bring in that context to the conversation we're going to have today, and to think about, as much as we can. I'm going to be mentioning a lot of different institutions and systems of the United States government, like the police or welfare systems or healthcare systems. And if we can just hold with us those as colonial systems in the whole conversation we have, that's something I would just invite. I think there's a lot of ways that our work is siloed, and we don't always do that. So I want to just begin there. Okay, cool. I love this image. It's something I got off the internet from other activists. Solidarity, not charity. We're going to be talking about that. So my talk tonight is about mutual aid. I began, obviously, as Alice said, I've been involved in mutual aid projects my whole time as an activist. Projects where people are actually helping each other survive the current conditions. That's what mutual aid projects are. And I started thinking a lot about mutual aid again, specifically as a tactic around the election of Donald Trump. I saw some things that worried me. I saw, this kind of call from groups like the ACLU, like really big, progressive organizations, kind of sending a message that I was worried was demobilizing. A message that says, what I got out of a lot of this was, we'll sue us out of this. Don't worry, you donate, we'll sue, and that's how we'll deal with Trump. And I was worried, right? There was an even worse one. They had this campaign where they asked us all to take the people's oath and pledge to protect the Constitution. What does that mean? People are really afraid and really scared and really upset by the election of this person, and we're telling people that the way to deal with it is to click something online where we all pledge to defend the Constitution. What does that mean? How do we operationalize that in our lives? What is that going to do? I could dream about the Constitution all day long. It's not necessarily going to change things for people. Obviously, all of the current violence happens under the Constitution, right, which was written by slave owners and settlers, et cetera. We could ask some questions about that. So this kind of moment was worrying me because to me what it felt like was people are being misdirected and demobilized through both fantasies about American law that I don't believe in, that we'll just sue our way out of things. We can look at the Muslim ban, right, and we can just see how that doesn't work, right? Trump loses in court a couple times, he rewrites it a little way, and now it's law, right? Like we can't expect US law to protect us from things like racism, Islamophobia, colonialism, because it is made of those things, right? So I was kind of, honestly freaking out about the ways that I perceived different forms of demobilization meeting people's real anger and fear, which is very mobilizing and can be very useful to building social movements that would actually win some of the things we want. So I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of discernment that we need in this particular moment where we have this increasingly siloing political culture in the US, really, really worsening dangerous conditions that are on top of the already long-term dangerous unresolved conditions. And one question that comes up, so one thing that's happening is that there are some legitimacy crises happening. Like, I think there's a legitimacy crisis about border enforcement happening in the US. Like, a lot of people are like, wait a minute, that looks really, really bad, right? I think there's a significant legitimacy crisis happening around policing in the United States, especially since the uprising in Ferguson and Baltimore. This is good, right? Our movements work hard to provoke legitimacy crises for these big institutions that harm us. The problem is, and I get this from one of the places I love to read about this, is in an essay that Ruth and Craig Gilmore wrote in the book Policing the Planet, which is a really great book that came out relatively recently. They wrote an essay where they basically said, oh yeah, there's been legitimacy crises of the police in the past, and usually what happens is after that, the police force expands and re-legitimizes and takes on new roles, right? So in the wake of the legitimacy crisis caused by anti-racist uprisings of the 1960s and 70s, you see, when I'm growing up, we have drug abuse officers coming into our schools. And now there's homeless outreach officers. The police actually take on new social work and education roles. It didn't shrink the police. And then police forces also now start to recruit people of color as police, women as police. These moments of legitimacy crisis don't necessarily result in the dismantling of the thing we're against. And this is a huge problem for social justice activists, right? Yikes, it is definitely a victory to provoke the legitimacy crisis, but it's a problem when what happens next, I'm using the word recuperation, recuperates that institution rather than dismantles it, which might have been, I believe, our goal, right? Because that's a dilemma that we face. And then I think the other dilemma we're facing at the same time is this question that I've mentioned before, opportunities for mobilization on the one hand, because a lot of people are angry and scared, and then also opportunities for demobilization, right? So one thing I'll just mention, and this could be because I'm a curmudgeon, is I think we have to think carefully about the opportunities for both mobilization and demobilization online, right? The ways in which new technologies are changing how we communicate with each other, and there's opportunities there and loss. So on the one hand, I think for a lot of people, the opportunity to communicate online breaks isolation. I especially have seen that in my history in trans communities. The first other trans people I ever met were all people I met through listservs back in the day, right? And I've heard this a lot from communities of people with disabilities. There's a lot of people who find each other online because we have different kinds of obstacles to finding each other in person. That's really, really important. At the same time, engaging with each other online can build isolation, and there's tons and tons of research coming out about how we're all much more isolated than we used to be, and we're involved in our screens and in our games and all of these things, and we're less likely to have face-to-face relationships, and that can cause some forms of vulnerability for people. People have less people to call when they're feeling sick. They have less people to get help with when they're experiencing violence in their relationship if we have less relationships that include some kind of in-person aspect. On the one hand, our lives online broadly distribute a lot of transformative ideas. We might have heard of more things, but the question is, how deep is our engagement? Is it just an engagement where we repost? It's a great entry point. How do we go beyond into actually, and now I'm participating in something in my community that makes this live, right? I think in some ways it's de-skilling us in some social practices. People are struggling with conflict and other things that happen in person. I have a lot of students who are really afraid to go to live meetings. They're afraid to be in intergenerational spaces. There's a lot of de-skilling about live interactions, and also there's amazing skilling up happening too, where people are defending each other online. There's some of that. It's both. A lot of the online engagement with our progressive or left politics can be very individualizing. It can be about branding myself as having the right analysis. That can, it can become about my personal identity as somebody who's got good politics rather than how I'm participating with others. And a lot of us are experiencing because of the amount of information we receive online, like a lot of overwhelm, a lot of exhaustion. I see this a lot in young people I work with, and a flattening of ideas, kind of all violence as being equal, like a loss of ability to discern. What feels urgent. And then I think like probably one of the worst things for us in terms of social relations that we're building is that there's, all of these online spaces are, of course, like built by and for capitalism, and so they're very hierarchical spaces, and there's kind of a fantasy that I'm gonna like find my public, and I'm gonna be the one who gets famous on YouTube, or I'm gonna be the one who gets famous on Instagram. There's a kind of social climbing that's deeply built into it that, when we live in various small communities, whether it's a campus community or whether it's a town or wherever we live in, or there's the 10 queers where we live, or whatever small ways we're broken out in our lives, you kind of at some point are like, oh, these are the people I have to deal with, okay, right? And you have to kind of treat people like you might keep them around. And if you think that out there somewhere is your public, which is the entire fantasy of even dating apps, all of these apps, is that there can be a sense of people becoming very disposable, and I'm gonna like climb my way to like the cool friends or the right-on people. And I think that those are not good skills for us to be practicing. I would consider that like internalized capitalism, white supremacy, ableism. Like it does all that, and we're practicing it a lot. And so then also I'm gonna like make myself look like I'm the coolest by like criticizing other people like me the loudest. And so there's a lot of takedown culture that's causing a lot of harm. So that's one thing that I'm worried has a demobilization effect. Also, honestly, I just have a lot of students who are exhausted from the fights they're having online, so they never actually make it out to join with others to do what they want to do, because they spend all their energy fighting with some person from back home in South Dakota about whether or not feminism is okay. And I'm just like, this is not the best use of your brilliance. I want you to have that if you want it, but I also want you to have experiences of building what you want with other people. And I think that that's hard to do. This is just a brief summary. Also, there's this long-term critique, mostly coming out of women of color feminist spaces, about how nonprofitization has also been a demobilizing factor that I just want to put in the mix here for us, right? Nonprofitization really takes off after the kind of uprising of the 60s and 70s, and we move to social movements being more filtered through that framework. As Dylan Rodriguez talks about it, it's kind of a carrot and a stick. On the one hand, we'll give you money for doing non-threatening work that doesn't get to root causes. On the other hand, we'll criminalize social movement organizations and people who are doing work that gets to root causes, right? So when we think about the FBI's long-term role in criminalizing social movement activists, et cetera, so we can see this kind of carrot and stick. That's concerning. It redirects us away from doing work that might be the sort of deep, transformative work we want to do, and it pays us to do work that's like depoliticized service work or minimal law and policy change that won't actually be implemented. Nonprofitization has also resulted in like the siloed issues and tactics, like we do abortion, we do climate change, we do, right, and then the kind of like separation and an inability to cultivate the solidarity that really actually makes movements very threatening and very transformative. And also, nonprofitization can kind of get us stuck in tactics where we're not looking at a long view. We're just like, this year, can we get a bill through, and then we'll be the top group in our topic. There's kind of the competitiveness piece. Or our funders are most interested in legal change and services. They're not interested in organizing, so we're gonna do legal change and services. There's a lot of critique about the ways in which nonprofits put a lot of power into people who have like high degrees and are professionals, right? So and they concentrate power and money in the hands of usually white people from elite schools. And so all of the ways in which once you have like a paid leadership body of experts, that's a really inaccurate way to understand how change happens, right? The best analysis doesn't come out of the most elite places. It comes out of experiences of systems that people come together and share their experiences and build a shared, like, you know about this part and I know about this part and this other person experienced it this way, and what does that tell us about this system and about what might be a mistake as a way to go or what reform might work, right? So this kind of paid leadership of professionals where your boss is like, this year we're talking only about judicial nominations, and you're like, but wait, I wanted to talk about housing court, and they're like, too bad. The hierarchy inside it and the kind of idea of who is qualified to determine what we do. In the same way, those are very undemocratic structures. They tend to be undemocratic structures dominated by philanthropists and then by the top people in organizations. They don't tend to build large amounts of people to make change. And I think most of the scholars and activists who I follow and have learned from believe that it takes tens of millions of people pushing for something to make deep, lasting, meaningful change. But most nonprofits are producing reports and bills, and it's not about like mobilizing lots and lots and lots of people, which is the way that I think historically change has occurred. Finally, one of the worst perverse incentives of nonprofitization is that you have to keep saying that what we're doing works, even if it's not, because that's how you get paid, right? And that's really, really, really rough, right? And so a lot of nonprofits relentlessly doing the same strategy that their funders like, but that may not be changing conditions in the community. And I think that's a painful thing. So I'm going to give you guys a few images of some of what this kind of recuperative politics that I think some of these conditions produce are. This is like, I should have told you to get out your barf bag. This is an example, right, of recuperative politics, right? When you have, I'm using a lot of examples from queer and trans politics because that's a lot of what I follow closely, but right, where you have, one of the institutions that's probably one of the most, here we are at the 50th anniversary of Stonewall this year, one of the most notorious sources of anti-LGBT violence, the New York Police Department, slapping a rainbow flag on their police car, right? That would be an example of the kind of recuperation project that's going to borrow from our community's symbols that are associated with freedom and liberation and hated groups and put it on top of something that actually really endangers us and get good PR out of that. This is a biggest pet peeve maybe of my life because I live in Seattle where this campaign is happening. The police, after coming under investigation by the Department of Justice for their brutal racist violence in Seattle, and after killing John Williams, an indigenous woodcarver, they launched this campaign. So these stickers are on like every single business door in Seattle. And the story is like, if you're experiencing an anti-LGBTQ hate crime, run in here and we'll call the cops for you. So it participates in this fantasy, one, that most violence happens between strangers on the street, right, which is like part of the fantasy of the police state, as opposed to the reality, which is that mostly we harm people we know very well, and that's where most harm occurs. So this kind of idea of having cops on the street who you call it's built up by that like false story about what violence is, and then also the idea that when the police come, it's going to make us safe, right? But this is an example of the Seattle Police Department, again, borrowing liberatory imagery from queer and trans communities in order to update their, basically to have a PR strategy, right? So it's a recuperation project for them that I believe queer and trans people don't get anything out of. This comic, I think, speaks to this moment. This comic is kind of old. It's from when the military decided to let women serve in combat. But I think since then, I don't know if you've all seen all these headlines about how now women run all the major defense industry, like Raytheon and all of these, and that woman runs the CIA now. So there's just like all these headlines about how wonderful it is that women run the military-industrial complex. That's an example of recuperation. Like, just because you can find women to run it does not mean it's feminist, right? It's, of course, the U.S. military, I would argue, probably the largest source of violence against women in the world, right? And so this comic is helping us think about that. Obviously, the whole history of the inclusion campaign around LGBT inclusion in the military does this same thing, where it asks us to take something taboo and liberating maybe about gay people kissing and puts it in camo in front of the American flag. And I've got to list this guy. This is the trans officer from the Israeli Defense Forces whose job is just to tour the United States and Canada and Europe, telling everybody that there's a trans officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, right? So again, taking trans people's struggles for liberation and using them to try to, people use the word pink wash, the brutality of another military. The thing about this sort of demobilization, demobilization I think goes hand in hand with vulnerability to propaganda like this. I think it's hard for people to read this propaganda right now, to be honest. I think this propaganda is working. One part of that is because we live in a context of denial and a lot of mythology about social movement histories, so we don't actually know accurate stuff about what social movements are and how they've made change, so it's easier to think just sending money to the ACLU will do it, or that having a gay flag on a police car means the police are good. I think also we live in the context where there's, partly because we've been denied the real histories of social movement, we're told what the sanctioned methods of dissent are, and I think it's useful to distinguish dissent from disobedience. I think disobedience is what we're looking to cultivate, but dissent is just sort of like, oh, I know what to do. I'll say what I believe on social media. I'll go to the Women's March once a year or whatever that thing is in my city, and I'll give to causes, and that'll be totally separate from my actual life. like that is kind of what we're being instructed to, how we're being instructed to understand our politics, and it's very distanced from us, and it's very kind of voluntary and kind of moral, like I'm a good person if I do it. And then I'll judge and hate anybody who does graffiti or who, does a more, robust or who, is trying to stop a pipeline or is doing something that's more that escalates the tactics. And this is what I said, right? This big separation between everyday life and doing something for a cause on occasion, and this kind of siloing of issues and tactics. Okay, so. One other part of this analysis that I want to throw in before we get to mutual aid is that part of what I think social movement activists, a lot of this I learned in the prison abolition movement, but I can see it in a lot of other spaces too, are doing is we're always trying to figure out how to have a really nuanced and thoughtful conversation and debate about whether a particular tactic or reform is recuperating an institution we are trying to get rid of or is actually moving us towards the world we want to live in. So for many years, I've used a set of questions for my criteria. I'll give you those. I've asked, does it provide material relief? This thing we're talking about. Like, is anyone going to get anything out of it? When after Trump was elected, I live in Washington State, and all the Washington State, local and statewide politicians got together, and they had a press conference, and they declared Washington a hate-free state. And they got up, and they said transgender, and they said Muslim. They named hated groups, and they were like, "We're down. We're so amazing. We're so not Trump." Right? They're the same people who are building that youth jail that Alice mentioned. They're the same people who are not. We're trying to get them to not let the deportation planes take off, and they're getting in our way. They're in it with the real estate developers. They're just like all the politicians everywhere else. But they've declared Washington a hate-free state, right? So that does not provide material relief. That would be an example of something we could assess. Like, is anybody gonna get anything out of this? Anybody gonna be less homeless, less locked up, less deportable? I always want to ask, does it leave out an especially marginalized part of the affected groups? So is it are they offering us, they're always doing this with various bills. They want to leave out people who are in Department of Corrections custody, or they want to leave out people who have been charged with violent felonies. They always want to leave out, and it's like, if you look at whatever group they're going to leave out, it's going to be people, it's going to have more people of color, and it's going to have more black people, and it's going to have more indigenous, it's going to be poorer people, it's going to have more people with disabilities. It's like that's who they want to leave out. It's not a coincidence that those things go together. Immigration reforms, we see the same kind of thing. We get these proposals that are like, it's only for sober people, it's only for anything that leaves out very vulnerable people. We have to ask, is this actually in our benefit, or is this sharpening a system of exclusion and violence against the very people that we most want to center? Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle, right? Is it like adding more cops because they're going to hire women of color cops, or they're going to hire trans cops? Is it going to are they going to build another wing on the jail or prison because they say it's going to make it safer or better or funner? This is, whenever it's expanding or legitimizing a system that we're trying to take apart, we've got to ask, is this what we want? And then also, all fights are short-term. All fights are we're doing this fight now to build for the next fight, to build for the next fight. You don't win it all at once, right? So are we doing it in a way that's actually going to build more people being mobilized to make it happen? That's a question that I think a lot of us ask. I want to give some other people's criteria that I admire. Peter Gelderloos has some criteria in some of his work. He asks, is it liberatory? I liked this one. Does it seize space in which new social relations can be enacted? It's such a good question. He was talking about the M15 movement in Spain, and I think he was a little bit talking about the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US. But did people go out together and do stuff that they're not supposed to do, like share things with each other? And I always think about during the Occupy Wall Street moment, in every city where I went to an Occupy encampment, people were making decisions by consensus outside together. Most people I've met in my life have never been to a meeting where decisions were being made that didn't have a boss or a parent or a teacher, someone telling you what's going to happen. This was people who don't know each other coming together and saying, we're all going to listen to what the other one thinks and try to come together to a decision that we can all live with. That is a radical, different social relation, right? So really interesting question to always ask, what are we doing in the way we're doing our work that's seizing space in which new social relations can be enacted? Does it spread awareness of its ideas? So this is not, have you heard of the hashtag? This is did you start a chapter? Did people in a participatory way spread the ideas and take them on as their own and do something they didn't get to do before? Does it have elite support? I love Peter Gelderloos. He says, essentially, this is his quote, If part of the elite supports a movement, it is much more likely that that movement appears to achieve victories when in fact that movement is insubstantial and supports elite interests. I think this is very sobering for us. We who try to get the city council member to come to our whatever, I think that's really, really, really helpful, and I appreciate his take on this. Oh, I have to acknowledge Jason Layden introduced me to Peter Gelder-Luce's work like a million years ago. Changed my life. Does it achieve any concrete gains in improving people's lives? So similar to my material change question. I gotta invoke Miriam Kaba because I'm in Chicago, and she's such an amazing force of brilliance. Shortly after the Ferguson uprising, she wrote a piece where she asked, how do we evaluate police reforms? So I think it's the same kind of conversation, and it was just so clear, I love it. Does it allocate more money to the police? If it does, we don't want it. Does it advocate for more police and policing? If it does, we don't want it. Is the reform primarily technology focused? This was so useful, right? Because at the time Obama was like, let's have body cams, which of course, it turns out all the footage is just used against the defendants and never used against the cops, right? Such a useful tool, and also it's all made by the same companies that make less lethal weapons and tear gas, and we just don't want to support any of that. Is it focused on individual dialogues with individual cops, right? So she's like, let's get away from the bad apple theory of police violence. Let's move away from the idea that we just need to change a few cops' minds. I just love, this to me is an example of an incredibly concrete, useful way that people are using this criteria to ask if something's recuperative or if it moves us towards what we want. Okay. All of this brings me to my renewed focus on mutual aid. So a few things about mutual aid. So I think of mutual aid as a way to both mobilize and help people survive right now. Conditions are very, very bad right now. I believe they're going to worsen in a lot of ways. Climate change related, the kinds of political climate we're living under. I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that we need to learn how to be both mobilizing and supporting people to survive right now. So mutual aid is about giving material support to people to survive existing systems, and it also is about political participation that's based in care and action. So plugging people in to direct work to help each other rather than just making open statements online or voting or just waiting for somebody to come save us, like the right presidential candidate or something. Not likely, right? So how to move away from symbolic system statements and gestures and just the kind of routine ways we've been told to express concern. And I think mutual aid ideally builds actual safety and well-being. It helps us survive and recover from disasters and prepare for the coming disasters. An important thing about mutual aid that I want to say, because we live in this context of where charity is a dominant notion in our politics, is that mutual aid is not charity, and let's talk about how it's different. So charity is all about rich people's generosity, right? Charity comes from, at least in part, like the idea of Christian people buying their way into heaven by deciding to give something to the noble poor, right? It's very much about rich people are the subject in the charity narrative, right? And that's a very limited framework, right? That's not very transformative, right? Charity tends to be about saving people and also blaming and controlling poor people. So it's usually, there's definitely can be a religious context to that saving, but there's also an idea of poor people as morally problematic and they need to be lifted up and told how to act right. So that can be everything from the fact that you're forced to take parenting classes if you're put through the child welfare system to, you can't qualify for housing in here unless you show us that you're sober, even though people who work here don't have to be sober, all of those things, right? That kind of, the ways in which charity systems, social service systems get super, super controlling of poor people's day-to-day lives and tell you exactly how you have to do everything. And that's all based on a theory that what's wrong here is with the person, not with the system that produced this person's homelessness or this person's, immigration status or whatever. So in that way, charity identifies the deserving poor. And the charity model is really the grandparent of the nonprofit industrial complex framework, right? That is the framework where we're gonna have essentially white people graduate from elite institutions and have a job managing poor people, right? And it's I think social work is a really big part of that. Law and legal services are a big part of that. And it's not that it's only white people doing that, but the model is a model of that centers whiteness and a certain kind of care that's about control and about determining who's deserving. So mutual aid is really different from this. The story in mutual aid is that the system, not the people suffering under it, are what create poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Mutual aid is about a commitment to the dignity and self-determination of people in need and crisis. So it's not how can we fix you? It's what do you think we all need to do to change the system? And in the meantime, let's help make sure you survive, right? mutual aid is about, I think, long-term commitments. Like people I know who are engaged in mutual aid programs that were like, we're gonna try to start this, giving people rides to the prison program, and we're gonna like stick to it for a while. Like it's about actually like digging in. We have a lot to learn. How does this really work? What's really gonna help people? What are the right spots for pickup? What are the right prisons to go to? What were we not thinking of? Oh my gosh, people need a different kind of vehicle to get into if they use a walker, whatever. Like the levels, it's about like committing to figuring out this work into the systems that we're working in really carefully. A lot of mutual aid projects are a pathway for people to join movements for the first time. What I notice is that people who are like afraid and angry about the current Trump administration stuff, a lot of people are like, what I first want to do is I want to help people who are facing it. That's people's first move. And then they get diverted into, or I'll send a donation, or I'll say something online. There's not a lot of ways to just go right in and help out. And so mutual aid projects are very appealing to people who are first coming to awareness that they are angry or scared, or they're so frustrated with what's happened to them or people they love or what's happening around them. So they're really useful that way. And many mutual aid projects, not all, do this through having some kind of open meetings or ways in, right? Mutual aid projects tend to engage in political education within the organization. So an example of this that is meaningful to me is that when the Sylvia Rivera Law Project was first starting, we had this overwhelming number of people who wanted to come help out. We couldn't pay people because we had no money, but we were like, okay, how are we going to bring everybody in? And so we formed this collective structure where lots of people who are not paid could be part of it and could do direct work to support the organization and the people who are coming to the organization for help. And we would do things like, one of the things we did is we screened this movie about the Young Lords because Sylvia Rivera had been part of the Young Lords, and we wanted all of us to know about the history of Puerto Rican resistance and to learn about the decolonization struggle in Puerto Rico. We didn't want just some people to know about that, right? So ideally, when you join a mutual aid project, you go in there because you're really mad about one part of it that happened to you or that happened to someone you love or that you heard about on the news. But then you also learn about all the other parts, right? Like, so people who come to SRLP, like, they might be really upset about what happened to them in the homeless shelter, but then when they get there, they might learn stuff about what's going on also for their friend who's part of SRLP who's in the immigration system fighting that, who dealt with this thing with the cops. And they might have before that been holding actually like xenophobic or racist or transphobic views. And it's through working together that we actually overcome all of that. Like, we all have a bunch of shared stuff from our society, right? And so there's ideally, solidarity is this muscle we build through mutual aid work because inevitably we end up confronting and having contact with a more complex version of the problem than the first part we knew from our own experience or from some representation of it. I think that a lot of people in mutual aid projects are working on, and we have to work on in order to work together, building skills that are not encouraged in our culture, which is about humility and willingness to accept feedback and to give frank feedback. What I notice is that most of us are pretty de-skilled in that. We're pretty defensive. We're pretty scared to find out we're wrong. And it doesn't really serve us. Maybe you can recognize this from your own day-to-day relationships, right? It's easier to see in others than ourselves. So that skill set of like, wow, can I take it when I'm in the meeting? People are like, Dean, you talk too much, or you know what, you really you got to slow this down, or you left these people out, or whatever. Can I build a skill where I desire to hear other people's participation, even if they disagree with me, where I want to know what they think because I want us to come to a decision where we all are fully invested in, instead of I just want to steamroll my idea through, right? A lot of this is about conflict resolution skills and processes. I think there's a lot of experimentation in a lot of mutual aid projects because there's conflict in every time you work with other people, there's conflict. And so there's a lot of really robust experimentation about how we can do this together. A lot of mutual aid projects are very interested in transparency and democratic decision-making. We should all know if there's money involved, where it came from and who it's going to. We should all know how this decision was made. We all want to learn the history instead of having a couple people kind of hold a lot of power. And I think a lot of this, many groups use consensus-based decision-making rather than majority rule because we desire other people's participation. So instead of saying, we're going to use majority rule, and then anybody in here who's a parent just got outvoted, so this thing is going to work for parents, or anybody in here who has a disability is not going to work because they just got outvoted because there's 2 of them and 10 of people who don't have that particular concern or question. That's actually not the way to build like robust, beautiful connection and the most accessible, open, participatory space. So instead, consensus allows us ideally to say, we care about every single person's experience in here. Even if it's only happening to one person, it's useful and important. And maybe there's nobody in here that this relates to, and we need to change this thing so those people can get here, right? We care about also who didn't make it here because we set it up in a way that kept somebody out. I think I'm not going to go through these examples because I think I'm going to show you, I think this is going to be the world premiere tonight of this animated video about mutual aid that I've been making with this young artist. And these examples are described there, so I'll just pause on the examples right now. I do want to share these challenges. I think this is important to just recognize some of the challenges of mutual aid projects. One is the concern that we would actually be helping the system function or expand. So, I mean, there's a million examples of this, but one that came to me, I was connected with this group of, it's like a human rights lawyer working in Bogota, Colombia, who has like a clinic at the law school there. And the clinic specifically works with people with disabilities and queer and trans people. And so they were working with this unit in the jail in Bogota that is, that's the unit where, in the men's jail where prisoners with disabilities are, and elderly prisoners are in this particular unit. And the jail was actually started to rely on the clinic to tell them when people should get out because they didn't have any system for knowing when people should get out. So the clinic would like look up people's records and try to figure out if they were over serving their time. And then it was like they were kind of became like an addendum to the jail. You know, they almost were working for the jail for free to make it work. And then the jail, the warden called them, actually the day that I visited, the warden was like, oh yeah, we want you to come meet with all the trans people in this jail. We're gonna put them all in the chapel. You come meet with them and figure out what they need. So there's this complicated way where sometimes we end up managing the problems of the very system we're trying to intervene. So that's a dilemma, especially if, you know, just another example of this in Seattle, you know, Seattle's politicians really like to feel very, very progressive, so they like to take, like the minute an idea is out of our mouths, they've taken it and are like running for office on it while they continue to expand everything terrible. You know, while they're building this new youth jail, the city and county councils have passed laws declaring they want zero youth detention, and they've hired staffers towards zero youth detention, literally while they spend over $230 million on a new youth jail. Like they just take the words right out of our mouths and slap them on the opposite thing that they're doing. It's up is down, right is left, whatever. But one thing that they've done is they've started doing some restorative justice circles for youth that the prosecutor's office runs, and so they've hired more prosecutors. You know what I mean? That's not the direction we're trying to go, right? So this is a dilemma. These are some of the dilemmas I think that we really face. And we also, our county exec, he's like the mayor of the county, he now goes around with this guy who runs one of the community-based diversion programs for youth, right? So this is like this, you know, very dedicated Black activist who runs this program, and now like our politician is like, you know, goes around with him, right? It's like for PR, and then like they have this terrible like special on TV about the two of them, and it was just, you know, it's like how do we stop our innovative ideas to support our communities from being used as cover, right, for these people when they say they want to work with us. Another dilemma about that, like I have a friend in Seattle who does a lot of other kind of transformative justice, restorative justice work, and now the prosecutor's office is reaching out to say they want to do, they want them to take on cases of youth charged with violent crimes, which is great because otherwise those youth would be going to be tried as adults. But at the same time, it's like they want you to come work for their system, and also it's a privatization. They don't want to pay her to do that. They don't want to pay that program to do it. They want her to raise money to be part of their system. They're still deciding who gets arrested. They're still deciding who gets charged. You know what I mean? Like we can become like kind of addendums or complementary programs to, and on the, you know, of course we want to stop any of those youth from going to prison that we possibly can, and also we don't want to legitimize the way they're arresting and charging and trying and all of this. And so these are like really hard problems. I'm not saying I have the answers to them. I think I just want to surface the kinds of things I think we're wrestling with that we need we need to engage with each other on it. There's also the dilemma that, you know, in terms of this last bullet, like about how do we, I think of the work of our movements as three things: mutual aid work, the work to dismantle the current systems, and the work to build the new social relations we want to live in, to build the things we need. You know, a new energy systems, new food systems, et cetera, that actually work for us. But there can be dilemmas, right? So you can do direct service work that doesn't get to root causes. You can do building alternatives works that are like utopian projects that are exclusive and don't include most people. Like a lot of land projects sometimes have ended up being that, you know, where it's like, we're gonna go do our thing and we're building this utopia, but most people don't have any access to it, so that can be a dilemma. Or you can, sometimes the dismantling work will value like militant actions, but not be connected to actually caring for people, right, and transforming social relations. So these are some of the dilemmas. I want to share a resource with you all about mutual aid. This is a website I made after the election. That's a mutual aid toolkit. It's called Big Door Brigade. And if you have historical or contemporary mutual aid projects that you'd like to see listed there, I'm just trying to direct people to examples, inspiration. All right, I'm gonna show you this movie. How am I going to find it? But I'm going to find this. Don't worry. Oh, wait, maybe this is it. Shit's totally fucked. What can we do? A lot of us are overwhelmed, pissed, and scared. I don't want to wait till the next election. I don't want to just write my congressperson and hope that they'll do the right thing. I don't want to just post things to the vacuum of social media. I don't want to just make statements about things. I want to change how things are. There are a zillion things we can do, and people are coming up with new ones all the time. This video is going to focus on mutual aid projects, what they are, and why we should be developing them right now. Mutual aid projects are a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, not just through symbolic acts or putting pressure on their representatives in government, but by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. During recent flooding and storms, we saw mutual aid in action as people helped each other survive. Mutual aid isn't just for those big weather disasters, it is also for the daily, routine, life-threatening disasters of capitalism and white supremacy. People who are pissed about police and prisons are doing mutual aid work like creating prison letter writing projects, where people get connected to pen pals in prison to build relationships, help prepare for release, help prisoners have advocates on the outside, and help build a movement against policing in prisons that is informed and led by the people who know the very most about how the system actually works. Some people are creating jail support programs where people get together to make a schedule and agree to be outside their local jail on that schedule and greet anyone getting out and help them get what they need. Maybe a ride, clothes, a phone to call contacts, information about services or benefits. Some people are organizing community bail funds, revolving funds that can pay people's bail so that they are not locked up while they try to prepare for their defense. Money bail systems are one of the ways that poor people and people of color are given the worst chances in the criminal system. Court support projects are where people coordinate to accompany someone facing charges to their court dates, ideally by packing the court with supporters each time, so that no one has to go alone, and sometimes to influence lawyers, judges, and jury by showing their support for the criminalized person. Some people are coordinating ride systems to help families visit prisoners who are being held in facilities far from home. In Oakland, the Oakland Power Projects are about strengthening people's skills to respond to community emergencies in ways that minimize police contact. When you call 911 for a health emergency, the cops come too, and that often leads to violence. The Oakland Power Projects is about training the community to respond to health emergencies, including mental health crises, chronic health problems, and acute health emergencies, so that people don't have to call 911. People who are scared about the emboldenment of ICE and Border Patrol and increasing deportations are doing things like forming rapid response networks, where people warn each other about immigration raids and help each other hide, and helping immigrants do safety planning in case they get detained so that someone is ready to take care of their kids and elders. Some rapid response projects are even working on training people to show up and physically stop ICE from taking someone away. Imagine if we built that kind of power to stop arrests through rapid mobilization of a lot of people to outnumber cops. No More Deaths, an organization in Arizona, works to save the lives of people crossing the border by putting food, water, and supplies in the harsh desert areas where people who are crossing often die from the conditions. There are so many mutual aid project possibilities because there are so many intense ways people aren't having their needs met in the brutal systems we live under. Like food projects like Food Not Bombs, projects where people organize temporary housing for people coming out of prison or foster care by opening their homes to each other, child care collectives where people watch each other's kids so they can go to political meetings, court, or jobs, projects where people accompany vulnerable people, like trans people or people with disabilities, to medical appointments or public benefits offices and hearings. Projects where people make sure neighbors being pushed out by gentrification have good access to information about their housing rights and accompany each other to housing court, help people read documents and defend themselves from eviction. Projects where people protest landlords who are refusing to make repairs or give back security deposits by directly protesting at those landlords' houses and businesses. The messages of this work are: the government is fucked, we can't rely on it. You are not alone. The system is the problem, not the person being targeted by it. And we're going to take matters into our own hands and help each other survive right now, rather than expecting help from the same systems that have a clear history of causing harm. Mutual aid projects don't just help with the current disasters, they help us prepare for the ongoing disasters that are emerging because of climate chaos and crumbling infrastructure. When we build cooperative projects, practice making decisions together, share things, meet more people in our communities and learn about each other's skills and needs, and learn how current systems work and how they are not working, we're better prepared for the next storm, the next blackout, and the next budget cuts. Something really important about all this is that mutual aid is not charity. Charity is where rich people and institutions give tiny crumbs to poor people to make themselves look better. Usually there are a lot of strings attached to what they give, like giving only to mothers, or only to children, only to sober people, or only to people of faith. Charity rides on the idea that rich people or social workers should decide who is a deserving poor and who is the undeserving poor, and that rich people can put conditions on the housing or food or cash they give poor people. Charity blames poor people for poverty. Mutual aid blames the system for making people poor and says everyone deserves everything they need. Charity affirms the existing distribution of wealth and life chances. Mutual aid challenges it. Charity is top-down, mutual aid is horizontal. Charity is about control, hierarchy, and isolation. Mutual aid is about solidarity, liberation, and participation. People are scared and angry right now and trying to find ways to fight back and support each other. Building mutual aid projects is a way to plug people in, build shared understandings of current conditions, offer meaningful support to vulnerable people, and prepare for the coming disasters. Mutual aid work is not easy. It means forming lasting commitments to doing hard work, collaborating with people even when we have conflict, and facing the heart-wrenching realities of the systems we live under. It is also deeply satisfying work that transforms us from being exasperated, passive observers of the shitstorm we're living in to inspired builders of the new world we desperately crave and need. Stop believing in authority and start believing in each other. We're all we've got. We're all we need. We've been working on that for years, so I'm very glad you guys clapped, because it's terrifying, like what if it's not good? But it's been a really fun process also. The last thing I want to say before we move on to conversation with Yanilda is just, I'm not even going to try to reopen this as a slide, because, yeah. A project that I'm really invested in right now is this work to try to change the conversation about trans inclusion in the military, which currently is a conversation that really is a recuperation project for the military. It's all about how it's a wonderful job that trans people deserve to have, and that we should want to serve, and that we should be allowed to serve, when really that's not what the military is. I think we're all on board with what I think about that. So anyway, this website, queertranswarband.com, has a toolkit where you can print out like these really awesome posters and stickers and t-shirt designs and button designs and do your own outreach in your own communities, especially at queer and trans events all summer that happen. So please spread the word about this to your friends if you're willing to. We can talk about that more during the Q&A if it interests you. And I'm just going to leave up this image I love from Seth to Bachman that I think really captures so much of what this mutual aid framing means to me. It's one of his older pieces, but I really like it. So thank you all.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yanilda Gonzales. I'm a faculty member over at SSA. And I'm so thrilled that I was asked and given this opportunity to engage in conversation with you. I have a strict time limit, so I have a ton of questions here for you. But I'm going to limit myself to a few, but I wanted to just make a comment, which is what I was saying to you as we were walking here, which is that as I've had the opportunity to engage with your work, Dean, I just find it so illuminating and clarifying in so many ways. And so as I was sitting here and watching your talk, it just clarified so many things for me with respect to sort of advocacy and activism projects that I'm involved in. So as somebody both who's as an academic and as a researcher works on issues of policing and reform, right, sort of all these things, I just, and in addition to that, works on advocacy and activism projects around that. I feel like a lot of light bulbs went off in my head as I was listening to your talk. And so once again, you've done it again, and just made things crystal clear for me in a way that I can't thank you enough for. So Dean, as I was listening to your talk, I wrote down a wonderful set of phrases that you said about the law, right? You started with, you sort of were talking about we need to sort of move away from these fantasies about American law, and we can't expect US law to protect us from racism, patriarchy, et cetera, because it's made of these things. And yet, little known fact about you, you're a lawyer, right? So, yeah. Right, so, and so I wonder how you decided, sort of course, many of us are in institutions and professions that we're critical of, but sort of how you decided to go into law and how you navigate the legal system as someone who is also deeply critical of it. And I think about that just in terms of the students around the room, and I was talking just today to a number of my students that want to go into the legal profession, want to go to law school. And so sort of thinking about this sort of autobiographically, how you made those choices and how you navigate those even to this day, and sort of what you would say to young people who are thinking about a career in the law, but that also want to enact more radical change.
Is this on? Yes, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people go to law school out of frustration with legal systems. I was part of grassroots movements and was like, people I knew were getting arrested a lot, and there was a lot of, it was hard to find a good lawyer sometimes who understood what we were doing or who wasn't a jerk to someone because of the ways that the person was different than the lawyer. And so I think I had about that much analysis when I went to law school. And that makes sense, and a lot of students I meet are in that position, but I think that what's missing in that narrative, it's very distorting, because we live in a culture that tells you if you're part of a community facing harm, you should go to law school and change the law, and that's what'll change things. And that's part of, I think, a very intense anti-black narrative in the U.S. that says that the U.S. was an anti-black place and that it was fixed through law, right? Through the elimination of slavery, through the elimination of Jim Crow, et cetera, which of course is an absurd fiction, right? Given the current real brutalities of anti-black racism. And so that story is we are taught that story constantly everywhere. And so it's when you see suffering, people are change the law. And I think what's really hard is that if we all kind of come up from that spell and look around, we're oh, right, housing discrimination on the basis of race and gender and disability is nonstop, and it's been illegal for half a century. And employment discrimination is nonstop, and it's been illegal for half a century. And in many ways, the government has sharpened its harm to the very people who it now says it protects, because we've seen this drastic growth of the criminal system and this drastic growth of the immigration system. So that's it's a sobering reality. I think that there is a limited role for lawyers like any other technician in our movements, because it's to do mutual aid projects, right? There are people who are going through the criminal system, so we should try to have them have as radical defense attorneys as possible who are not going to be transphobic to them and not going to be ableist to them, ideally, right? We always need specialized people in particular things, but not at it's very disproportionate to the number of people who think they're going to law school to change the world. And then, yikes, law school is still teaching a curriculum from the 1800s. It is law enforcement school, that's what it should be called. It is all about memorizing what a bunch of white judges have said and learning what you can say to a white judge. It's not about learning how social change works. That's not what law schools are about. It's about memorizing the existing system and only arguing within it. So people do not get the political development they're looking for, and they usually get pushed off track if they went there to change the world. So I really discourage people from going to law school unless they have gone and worked with lawyers somewhere and seen what they're doing and being like, they are actually having a satisfying experience of the thing I actually want to do, and they needed a law degree to do it. Because there's a lot of legal work you can do without a law degree. Like you can go help people with welfare hearings, which are like kangaroo court, without a law degree. You can help people through housing court without a law degree. You can, and there's, like the law degree isn't essential for so much, including like legal work. And also, just to be real, I was a poverty lawyer, and most of what you do is you just tell people bad news. You're just like, yeah, you don't have a pathway to immigration. Yeah, you are going to be evicted. There's nothing I can do. Yeah, we can't get you out of prison. The law is not on poor people's side. So you can have a lawyer all day long and not get help, which doesn't mean there's never a time when a lawyer has helped somebody. But I just think it's a very over-determined narrative in the U.S. And I think it's also really important. Like I learned this from critical race theory, but I feel like the gay and lesbian rights, like mainstream framework, has not learned this at all. You can get people protected under the law, and it's not going to change the lives of most people facing the worst harm. But the U.S. narrative will be that now we've achieved equality, and now we can bomb other countries if we think they haven't for that thing, right? This is Trump's got this like pro-LGBT thing only when it comes to Iran, So I think that there's a lot of questions we could ask about the role of legal change itself, because most legal changes are never implemented or are actually to sustain the status quo.
Thank you for that, Dean. I was also struck by another thing that you, another observation of yours from the talk, which is the capacity of institutions to reproduce themselves even in the midst of and following crises of legitimacy. And I think that sort of for those of us who've been in Chicago in recent years, right, this will ring true as somebody who studies policing, right, that the sort of post-Laquan McDonald scandal, sort of Burge torture survivors, sort of scandals, and the crisis of legitimacy that police face post-Ferguson and sort of here post-Laquan McDonald, that resulted ultimately in sort of calls to hire 1,000 more police officers, a $95 million, police academy on the west side of Chicago, right, so that the crisis of legitimacy, not 1 year had elapsed, right, when it was, the kind of reproduction that you're talking about happened. What are some ways that you've identified the process by which these happens, right? Because sort of crises are moments of critical junctures. There's many ways that things can go, right, in a moment of crisis, and yet it so regularly, as you've observed, it goes the way of reproduction of these institutions, right? So what are some of the ways that you've observed? What is the process by which that happens? And how would you say to folks around the room for us to be vigilant, and observe that process as it's happening, name it as it's happening, and hopefully intervene to develop a different outcome?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I moved to Seattle kind of at random because I got a job there. And I'm so glad I did, because I think it's the cutting edge of this kind of exact bullshit. And so it's like really good to study it, right? Like Seattle, on paper, they're doing like the most social justice of everything. We've had not one, but two gay mayors in a row who suck, so are bad on everything that I care about, so there's the piece around stealing our talking points. There's a piece around this reductive identity politics they're supposed to get one of us somewhere high and then it's all good. I think that one thing I'm concerned about and I've noticed in Seattle, one of the things that happens is that Seattle will create a program that's supposed to address the problem, like a lot of diversion programs, our youth diversion programs, and also like we have a whole diversion program that's about the police diverting people to social services instead of arresting like homeless people and people who are like out on the street. There's like various diversion programs we have going in the city. They'll create them, they'll barely fund them, 5.5 people will go through it, and then it'll be declared a failure. Right, because white upper class people are still feeling uncomfortable on the street in that neighborhood. That's our assessment. That's our assessment tool. And so it's interesting to think about that. Like all the politicians claim it as their signature program there, and then they get criticized by the right for it because the streets are still full of dangerous whoever's. that cycle is interesting to watch. And I recently was having a meeting with somebody who runs one of those programs that our lead prosecutor claims as his, special fig leaf of the realities of what he's doing. And she was telling me that she thinks the window of criminal justice reform is actually closing in Seattle. The moment we had that was marked by all of these really important national cases that changed this climate. And I really am curious whether other people are feeling that, and that is very scary to me. Oh, and then I spoke to somebody else who's a diehard abolitionist, and she said she feels the same way. So I was speaking to people with two very different strategies, and they both felt that the window of criminal justice reform being like kind of a mainstreamed popular topic is closing. And I'm like, but nothing hasn't happened yet. Like, we didn't even win anything yet, barely. You know what I mean, right? Like, I haven't seen a reduction in police violence. I haven't seen the prisons shrinking where I live, or the jails, or the other kinds of facilities. So that's really scary. One thing I've noticed, I think there's some strategists I work with, especially people who are grassroots strategists around immigration enforcement, abolition, who I think are always looking more steps ahead than the rest of us. And I think that's like a thing. I don't know how you learn to do that. I just follow their lead, but like how do we anticipate the counter moves better? And I think we have to be a bajillion times bolder in what we're demanding, because the counter move is always just to absorb us if we've said something palatable. And I think that's a real danger in the political context we're in, is to say the palatable version, put the person in front who people are gonna like. And like in the trans context, there's been this whole period where like some of the more mainstream lesbian, gay, like legal rights organizations, like they all like were encouraged by one of their funders to work with like a PR firm who would talk to non-trans people and decide which ones of us they like. And not surprisingly, they found that non-trans people feel more comfortable with trans people who pass as non-trans people. And so these legal organizations were supposed to then use them as plaintiffs, right? So if you win stuff for them, it won't have won it for most people, especially not the most vulnerable trans people. Those kind of, like the lack of boldness and imaginativeness, I think is related to us believing in authority. That's why I love that graffiti about stop believing in authority. It's like, we have to utterly imagine that we can actually run our lives and our spaces together collectively and have collective self-determination, which most of us can't imagine because of the society we live in order to have a counter strategy to the absorption, I think.
Very sobering and good reminders, right? The sort of reimagining is a key aspect of this work. So I think we have about 12 to 13 more minutes left in the program before we can get on to the reception and everybody can have an opportunity to chat with you. But I want to open it up. I shouldn't be the only one that gets to ask you questions. So I'd love to hear from folks in the audience. If you have any questions for Dean, there's a mic right there in the center aisle.
So many fun topics, and I'm not an expert on any of them. So I'm trying to find a question that encompasses all of it. Let's take Seattle, for example. What is either an idea of a pilot program or maybe a program that has been established that maybe was underfunded, that you think, a government program, so I'm going to challenge you into a space, that you think your idea that should be continued, that is beneficial to the scalable way for children, which I think is a very challenging concept of self-determination and a social effectiveness, because they don't really get to decide what's best for them. So I'm throwing you I'm going to make you think of the government, you work for them, maybe the police, maybe the social services, maybe an existing program. Let's just take Seattle. What are some of your favorites? Because I want to hear some optimism in all of this.
Seattle has a good composting program.
I agree.
One thing that's interesting to me is that Seattle used to have a thing where there was a ride-free zone in the downtown. All the buses were riding where you could ride for free. To me, that's an example of something we could just expand to the entire transit system. Instead, they've recently hired huge numbers of fare enforcement police. So there's a million things where you could go either way. You could spend $230 million in the new youth jail, or you could spend it on childcare. You could spend it on housing and income support for low-income families, who are the ones who are going to have their families ripped apart in that new jail and court house. I think, as an anarchist, I don't think that like all the answers are going to come. I haven't noticed the U.S. government being something that's going to lead us to our liberation. But I also am not interested in purism, so I absolutely will fight for free transit, and I will absolutely fight for state-supported childcare. You know what I mean? But I think my ultimate, like my deepest belief about what we're actually winning is about building self-determination through community-based solutions. And I also think that there's this speeding freight train coming towards us with climate change, and we are the kinds of strategy, like trying to get the city government of Seattle to make a good transit system is not going to happen in the timeline of that we're working with climate change. But everything we do to organize that now, and all the ways in which I end up knowing my neighbors or knowing other people in Seattle, and all the ways in which I know like who lives down the block, who is going to need help if the elevators aren't working, and who lives over here and has kids and whatever. The more we all know each other and work together and figure out how to make decisions together and share stuff, the more we'll be prepared for the disasters that are coming. That I think we're going to see collapse of the kinds of systems that we've been somewhat relying on and somewhat not relying on, depending on our social positions. So it's a complicated one to think about the government piece. I don't think there's any role for the police, in my view, like at all, period. Whereas I think there is, right now I'm pretty into the bus system, but also could imagine ways that it's disconnected from the police. And so I think that it's a nuanced question, but I think the way it looks day to day is having an agenda for our cities that's a solidarity agenda with people working in lots of different silos, where I'm like, I'm going to be down with transit stuff, even though I'm mostly working on this other stuff. We're going to have shared demands and share and lift each other up and make all those bolder and bolder. I should have said that too in the question you just asked. Like, what I've noticed is we get more success when we organize in a way. It's usually the volunteer-based groups where nobody's paid who raise the boldness of the demand and then hold the other advocacy groups that might be more nonprofitized to it. And I've seen this like in our social movement ecology in Seattle, where this group called Resistencia, that's their goal is to close the Northwest Detention Center. They have held the abolitionist line around immigration, and they keep pushing other groups to not make certain compromises with the government that allow the government to pass like these fake laws that don't end up helping anybody. And they've really changed. In like 5 or 6 years, they've totally changed the likelihood that those groups will come along and will feel held to the fire about being more bold. So I think that's part of this too, is like in the course of these struggles, ideally we're building like deeper solidarity with other groups that are demanding things of systems, and so that we get less of these like fake victories, I hope.
Quick double dip.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a line behind me. So I'll take you out of the government. From a social program for children who have parents with the substance situation, which I know is big all over America right now. Any favorite local program that on a wide reach helps that constituency, which cannot speak for itself?
I don't have a favorite program like that. No, I don't. But I mean, I think one thing that's interesting in Seattle is we do actually have some harm reduction worked in to our substance abuse social services programs. Like we have programs where you don't have to be sober to get housed, and we have there's a big push for safe consumption spaces. So some of that, I think all of that benefits families and benefits children because their parents are less likely to be criminalized and more likely to get housed and be able to be in their lives. So I think some of those, I would say, like harm reduction principles when dealing with substance abuse end up with, I think, kids suffering less.
Awesome, thank you. Learned a lot.
Hi, I just wanted to talk about the consensus decision-making that you were advocating, that I think that in some situations where there is a lot of conflict, it doesn't really work. I'm reminded, and since this is Alumni Weekend, I don't know if anyone was part of the Haymarket newspaper collective back in the day, and a friend of mine referred to it as the tyranny of the insomniacs. So I think, and I studied, just being Alumni Weekend, with Jane Mansbridge here, who, in a little history, did not get tenure at the University of Chicago and is now at Harvard. And she wrote a book called Beyond Adversary Democracy, which talks about using different types of decision-making for different situations of the degree of converging interests. So that in some situations, consensus makes sense, but in other situations, you need to have a majority rule type situation. Not that, or some other kind of mechanism, that consensus is just going to be debilitating.
Yeah, I think I recently read this book called Resisting Illegitimate Authority. I just love that title, right? What we want, the point of all of this is to resist illegitimate authority. So just because you're the boss and I'm the employee, or you're the parent and I'm the child, or whatever, like is it legitimate? Or is it like, oh, like you're teaching me carpentry, you actually know what's safer for us to do with this saw, right? So I think one of the questions is, people often say consensus decision-making doesn't work. They also often say, like, transformative justice doesn't work because we don't get, because it was, full of conflict and people didn't have, the perfect outcome. But we know what hierarchies do. So the question is, I think, how can we just keep refining what we're learning about other ways of making decisions? I think, for example, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project is an example of a consensus-based organization that's, been around for 15 or 16 years, and we just keep experimenting with it. But I think what we've noticed, for example, is that having the work split off into teams and being able to delegate to people that you're dealing with, this whole team is dealing with all of which clients we take and don't, and this team's doing this, but we come together around big work plans and we make big decisions together as a group. We want to make sure everyone understands the budget, but this team is doing the details of allocating on the day-to-day or doing check requests. Some consensus decision-making groups have done too much, we're all going to be in the room when we decide which toilet paper to buy, and that doesn't work, right? So there's a lot of refinement we can do about how we come to consensus, but the point of it, which is that we actually care about everyone's participation, rather than that we're going to give somebody the illegitimate authority to just decide for everyone, or we're going to give the majority group, which just has to raise questions for all of us who've been narrated as minoritized groups. So I obviously don't, I'm not purist about anything. People should just experiment and do what they try to do, whatever they do. But I think I do want to resist saying that it didn't work just because it was messy and hard, because we're doing all of our work under impossible conditions. We're living in such horrible anti-revolutionary times. We're all so traumatized. We've all internalized these systems so deeply, it's really hard. And so, of course.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I don't want to end up being in the tyranny of the insomniacs of consensus decision making. We have to, and that just becomes debilitating for.
We have just
the
a few
movement.
minutes left in the program. I'm so sorry. I want to encourage. I want us to move this energy, this amazing energy, into the reception. I want us to just take in the final two questions together. Sorry, one and the other, and then briefly, please, and then have Dean respond, and then. Susan Zesh will close us out. And thank you so much for understanding to the last questioner. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So having worked in a public defender's office and coming at the work from a prison abolitionist perspective, how do you rationalize, or I guess what is your vision for justice where in the current system we have certain victims of violent crimes are going to see it as they're not getting equal justice, but at the same time you do want to acknowledge that the system is ultimately what is creating a cycle of violent crime. So,
Thank you. Can we take the second question as well, and then we'll have Dean respond to both? Thank you.
Hi, so kind of a related question. So I was just wondering your point about how the legal system in the U.S. is itself perpetuating a kind of white hegemonic set of ideals. So I was just wondering. What are your thoughts on the way to move forward? Because one way is seemingly to sort of incorporate more fringe voice, namely Black, women, LGBTQ. But just wondering, is would we need more in terms of a violent rupture of the system? Is that the way to go? Or yeah, thank you.
Great. I hope I understand the first question correctly. I mean, I think that the abolitionist take on the current justice system, at least from my perspective, is that the things it promises us, it promises safety, it promises to make victims whole and to prevent future violence, it doesn't do, right? It is a form of violence, so it's kidnapping and caging people, and it's doing that on the basis of race and poverty and indigeneity and disability and stuff. And then the alternatives that people are creating are trying to actually do those things. So trying to actually say, what would be likely to make this not happen again? What does the person who did the harm need to not do the harm again? What can help the person who was harmed like be as well as possible given what happened, which the criminal system does not care at all. It doesn't help you have housing after you've been harmed. It doesn't help you get mental health care. It doesn't help you get babysitting. No, that's stuff that our communities give us, if anybody. And then it also asks the big question, like, why do things like this happen? Like, if I embezzled from the organization, then maybe we all need to talk about how we run our organizations and whether enough people are looking at the checkbook, because how was I able to take all that money, right? Or if I, keep sexually assaulting college freshmen, we might ask, well, what is it that's creating like the way we do transportation after our parties and the way people talk and think about gender and sexuality, whatever. We can actually change like the way we socially organize around potential harm. So that's my vision. That's, I guess, how I think that we think about what real justice would be, as opposed to a system that masquerades as justice but really mostly provides a lot of violence. And it makes sense that, in trans communities, there was this thing for years and years where anytime you went to like a forum, people would be like, they're punished less for killing us than they'd be punished if they killed a dog. And then there was a kind of narrative that measured the worth of trans people's lives against how much somebody got punished. And that makes a lot of sense in our culture, but actually, after we're already dead, it doesn't really help if you punish people. What we want is most trans people who are getting killed because they don't have access to a safe place to live inside and be a safe work, right? They're living under extremely dangerous conditions because of poverty and racism and transphobia. So I think that's the other, we can't look at the criminal system without looking at what makes different people vulnerable to harm, right? And more harm happens to people because of poverty, because of homelessness, et cetera. And this question about the legal system, definitely I'm not advocating for incorporating more fringe voices. Like, I think that, we're gonna get a trans judge, we're gonna get a trans cop, or we're gonna have a black gay mayor or whatever. Like, I think we've all seen what that looks like. I love Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, From Black Liberation to Black Lives Matter, maybe it's the reverse, but she has a chapter in there about the moment where there was a move towards electoral politics and black politics in the US and this whole campaign in Ohio. Anyway, it's such a great chapter. I recommend everyone read it. But yeah, I think we've learned a lesson again and again that they'll incorporate those of us who will do the work, who will operationalize their work. So I think what we're really asking for is to starve the system. Like when we do the work that's about not calling the cops and instead having other ways to respond to harm, to hide immigrants from the system, to whatever we can do to take away the system devouring our people, and then also to dismantle it, to be like, no, you can't build another jail cell, no, you can't, and to get them closed. Like, there's a huge campaign where I live to close the detention center in Tacoma, but part of that is to try to get the city of Tacoma to take away its business license. Like, that's smart, Like, we're doing it a million ways. We're going at them from all angles. We've got this, the state attorney general suing them because they pay people $1 a day who work in there to maintain it. And we've got, we're out there every weekend protesting, we're just coming at it from every direction. That dismantling work is really vital right now because these systems are still growing themselves, often in our names. They're like, oh, they're gonna build a new wing that's gonna, Geo is actually talking about expanding that facility to make it not violate people's human rights so much, right? So I think that's more the question, less incorporating us into it and more like closing it down.
Wow, thank you so much, Dean. Please join me in thanking Dean Spade for sharing these really wonderful insights. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Zesch, the Executive Director of the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, who will give us some closing remarks.
Well, thanks to Dean and Yanilda for a really interesting conversation, which we know will continue into the reception. I wanted to say just a couple of things. One is, I'm struck tonight by how the legacy of Dr. Bob Kirschner is carried out in what we're talking about today. One way that is very obvious to those of us who know the story is that our Human Rights Lab now has been built around the work that has come from all sorts of advocacy which came together to the struggle for reparations for the victims of police torture here in Chicago under Commander John Burge. And we have a very wonderful alliance under Alice Kim's leadership with the Chicago Torture Justice Center and the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. Bob Kirschner was the forensic pathologist who got up in federal court and called what they were doing at Area 2 torture. He was an international expert on torture. And when Dr. Jack Raba from Cook County Hospital and the public defenders in the Andrew Wilson case came to him and said, well, this man has been tortured. Bob first didn't believe it. He said, well, no, they don't do that in Chicago. And one of the things he said was that when he heard Andrew Wilson describe what it felt like to have electroshock given to him, he realized that it was real, because that was not the sort of information that just kind of generally circulated among people, that to be able to describe that meant that you had it done to you. Now, of course, Judge Duff didn't want to allow him to use the word torture in court, but Bob played a very important role in opening up these cases, and that is some of the foundation for some of the advocacy that Alice is able to help us bring to our students' experience. The other is that I learned last spring when I was visiting San Francisco, or this past spring in April, that, did we have a spring this year? That Dr. Rohini Har, who was a student of Bob's when she was here in the college and worked with him when she was in the medical school, has now been named, she's the youngest participant, she's just turned 40, in an international group of physicians and lawyers who are revising the Istanbul Protocols, which is the official UN document which describes the medical diagnosis of torture. So Bob's role as a teacher, it's something that we all want as teachers, that our students are going to be able to carry on and expand the work we did. So I thought with the Kirschner family here, I wanted to acknowledge how Bob's legacy really lives through our program. And then lastly, I do want to thank our donors who are here. A lot of you are named in the program book, and I also want to acknowledge Richard Pozen, who's here for his 50th college reunion, and has been very important to us. He and his wife, Ann, have been for us the best sorts of donors, because we have a relationship built on trust, where they trust us to do things with the resources like bring people like Dean Spade to campus, and we've been able to really exercise our mutual creativity and ideas of solidarity based on the resources that all of our donors have given to us. So I wanted to thank them. And now finally, I want to invite you all to what the Kirschner family is fond of describing as a lavish reception. That means that it's not just chunks of cheese. So please come and join us with the food we get from Piccolo Mondo, who's at one of our neighborhood restaurants. And let you know, Dean's going to be back in the fall. Dean will be back here as the Pozen visiting professor in human rights. So those of you who Dean will be teaching a course for 10 weeks, and those of you who represent various organizations in the city may want to start booking him now for coming to visit and talk with your constituency. So thanks so much for coming to join us and your illuminating talk tonight. Thanks to Yanilda. Thanks to all of you for coming, and particularly thanks to the staff of the Pozen Center, Ashley Pierce, Kirsten Ginsky, Kathy Scott, our departing peer leaders and student workers who break our hearts by graduating. And we're very happy to have this celebratory moment at the end of what has been a very interesting academic year. So, see you at the reception.